vinyl records and
It's
record
exactly,
players, right?
it's
I mean,
the same.
it's similar, right?
That's right. Young people buying them, it's, I mean, not my generation, which is we bought them originally.
Right, and so that there's something there's a certain they're buying some sort of ambiance, or there's some sort of maker feel to it that
some
you don't.
Mystique that has to do with going in the dark room and seeing the print come up, or putting the platter on the turntable.
Sure.
Some kind of old. I don't know if it can't exactly be nostalgic because it's not their own past. It has something. It's esoteric or specialized.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people still respect the maker's hand, right? And people respect labor, right? And I feel like that there's probably film photography probably lends itself a little bit more to that than just the digital process. But the series you were mentioning, the window series that you did in conjunction with being honored by the Dallas Art Fair a couple of years ago. I love those images.
I'd love to show them to you downstairs just to see the real prints, because you've just seen them online.
Yeah, I've just seen them online.
They're really nice.
Just because in my work, I love layers and the way you're toying with planes and so maybe you can describe these pieces to folks that are listening.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Well, I give a little. So I said earlier that if you have that making images in the classical sense is no longer quite enough, and that you have to come up with a strategy. Mm-hmm. And so I had this idea that I was given. Somebody said, we'd like you to have a show at a community college in Dallas. And I thought, I just don't want to put up pictures that I've taken somewhere else and put them up there because that's what I want to do, something different. So I went to this gallery to look at the space over at Brookhaven, and it was this odd little room, again, back to the architecture. And I noticed that there was a Venetian blind that was creating little panels of little lights, highlights, and shadows and things, and a few other things. So I came back with my camera, and I photographed the shadows on the white walls of the blinds, mini blinds, and then I photographed a wall using a wide-angle lens, just this plain white wall, and I did a couple other little things. And when the show happened, what I did was I printed a big print that was about 24 inches by, whatever that is, 20 feet or something.
Right.
And it was a photograph that was mostly white, but had just a little parts where the Venetian blind shadow had been. And I put it exactly over where the Venetian blind shadow had been. And of course, that travels during the day.
Sure.
So, and then I took the picture that was of the entire wall, and I made a small little print of it. And I put it right on the wall, a small print of the wall.
Right.
So the idea is when you're standing there looking at this one wall, you don't, because it was really a white photograph, and it was matte, and it blended in and to the wall itself, the stuccoed wall.
Right.
You didn't know you were looking at a photograph, but then you looked and you say, well, what's this? and then if you were there longer, you could see the same shadow moving across the room, but not on the photograph. So I wanted to create this immediacy. Then if you looked at the other wall, you're standing there and you'll say, I don't see anything. And then you look at this little tiny picture, and then you notice, there's a little plug, a little tiny part where there's an electric plug outlet. And that's right. So I'm looking at a tiny picture of this big wall I'm standing in front of. So the idea for me was to activate in the viewer this kind of, make them, instead of just a passive viewer, they sort of had to figure out, what are they looking at?
Right.
Okay. Now, And then I had a little book there, and I told people, take a picture, post it online on a hashtag, and some people did it, and some people, anyway. But the whole idea was to turn it into a kind of, I don't know, performance or conceptual piece or something like that, to activate it in time. And so that was a strategy to take the straight photograph and do something. So I was given the opportunity to have my photographs displayed in Neiman's window. And I thought, I don't want to take pictures of like dying people or Taos or anything and put them in Neiman's window. And so I started going and looking at Neiman's window to see what the window they were going to give me. And I saw all these amazing reflections that when you see the mannequins in there, and then you see they were doing some construction across the street, and you got this amazing collision that looked like double exposures, but they weren't. And the thing that's so remarkable to me, that I am so fascinated by, is how our brains perceive things. So if we are standing and looking at something that's highly reflective, like looking into a window there, we want to see the dress, the mannequin. And our brain just totally the reflection is there, but it just, we don't perceive it.
Right.
And this has to do with like drawing, you know, what are you really seeing? Not what you should be seeing, but is that arm foreshortened? What does that really look like? So that's what I started seeing, is all of these collisions right on top. And as I've gotten older, I've wanted to make images that are more complex, that are a strategy. Instead of having like a simple subject matter, I wanted to sort of have a diffusion across the screen about what's important here. So the composition and how I worked with all of that push-pull was so the confusion was one of the things I was interested in. And then very often I could get this visual confusion, which has to do with a mental confusion, or lack. I mean, in a very positive way, you could say it's diffusion, or you could say it's numinous in some kind of other way. But I also then still had a narrative. I could sometimes contrast the people who are walking on the street, who might be homeless or in their own thought, with the mannequins and all of the things that the mannequins suggest about class, about pageantry, about luxury, about the idealized youth. And so I got these contrasts, which are not unlike I've always been interested in social class. And when you look at the baby series, you can see social class, economic class really at play there, and contrasting that as a group. And now I'm doing it within a single photograph. So that's just another example of how I have things that are unifying throughout, even though they might look really different.
Yeah, some of those reflections, I mean, I was really astounded at the clarity of the reflection. Like, it was really shocking. And
that has to do with depth of field. Depth of field, you can take your camera and you can focus. You always have to focus it on one point. But you can either have narrow depth of field. This was my class that has to do with the f-stop. You can have that everything behind that point out of focus, everything in front of it, or you can have it all sharp. So I was playing very, very carefully with what I wanted in and out of focus. Did I want it all sharp, or only want one plane? And I would adjust my aperture and actually my focal length of my lens. So we were back at some very, very basic things. And and in photographic technique, and even there's, I think, some I don't know if in those I've got some shutter speed, but stuff going on. But I really love the camera. I love camera vision. And now, so what I wanted to do, so again, the strategy was I was making these pictures, but I was going to put these pictures in the window. So somebody is standing there saying, where are all these reflections coming from? And then they're supposed to say, well, my God, there are reflections. I can't even believe I'm looking through this window. So it was the same thing. I wanted them to activate, energize that experience. Standing. Now, whether anybody did But
Sure.
but it was I wanted something more.
To go back and display those in the same windows that they were taken in, it's not the word's not irony, but it's very that's
well,
right.
it has a conceptual aspect to it,
right?
And so I guess I would say that I've been in having Hugh talk to me, I had not quite articulated it, but your lead-in question about where is photography going and all the stuff has made me see that there was a desire to contemporize, to not accept the photograph in the same way that I had been making photographs.
Those pieces
in the
are
past.
Incredibly contemporary.
Oh, I want to show them to you downstairs.
Yeah, but this conversation is one I've had a couple of times this week, and it's something I try to impart on my students, and that is how the most rewarding images, the ones that make the biggest connection with the viewer, are the ones where the viewer has to have a sense of self-discovery. They are having to dig, and when they dig, they find something unexpected versus the very straightforward, right? And, and that could lend itself. I had a student that was sharing with me poetry that he had written recently, and that was one of the things I had noticed in his poetry, was that it was very straightforward, and I'm like, I think your reader's going to appreciate this poetry a lot more if there are veiled references, if there are double entendres, if if they have to, if they're not sure exactly what you're talking about, and then in the end are able to piece it all together. And that's again something I think of in poetry, and I think of in visual imagery. If we can accomplish that, that's art that's at a different level than just the kind of hitch between the eyes with something, right? And so the ability to have those very contemporary images, juxtaposing what's going on. I mean, like you said, there's issues of class about what's going on in the principal image versus reflection, and then you layer that on top of it being displayed back in there, and that's wonderful. And just you're really fortunate with just the colors that they're not putting the dull drab out there in those windows, and so you just beautiful colors to work with, and so that's that's really interesting. So I saw somewhere where you were currently, and I think when I ran into you at the Dallas Art Fair, you're in the middle of a project there, right? In this. Is that something you've been working on for a couple of years? Well,
both of these projects, the window project, which happened like it's been actually just 2 years, because this is the third Dallas Art Fair. When they made me the honoree for the art fair, I somehow, I'm not quite sure why, but I got really interested in the art fair itself.
Right.
And the art fair is really only 3 days, or 4 days were kind of a private day. And I got to go to all the events that related to that. And I noticed that, realized that the space that the art fair is held in is also a place where they have clothing, a market for clothing. And they also have weddings that they rent out. And that they build all of those walls for 3 days. on the second floor. All of those walls are built for 3 days.
They always seem to be in